Então tá legal. Pessoal, muito boa noite. Eu sou Marcelo Cabral, sou o host aqui do Entre Mundos, que é esse canal de entrevistas, que é o canal de entrevistas da Unus Mundos, que é a revista digital da Academia ABC2, uma revista digital que já está indo para o seu terceiro ano de existência. E nós temos, assim, muita alegria de ver como essa revista tem atingido pessoas através dos seus ensaios, artigos, colunas, podcasts, estudos de livros, né? É uma revista de alta cultura, como nós gostamos de falar, que promove essa conversa inteligente entre a fé, as ciências e a filosofia, e a gente tem fornecido aí para o nosso público diversos recursos para enriquecer as nossas mentes, provocar as nossas reflexões, para pensar, a partir de uma perspectiva cristã, como entender os vários âmbitos, as várias relações, os vários aspectos da realidade. Então essa revista tem sido um produto, assim, fantástico, do qual a gente se alegra muito. É nessa revista também que nós temos publicado os ensaios e estudos de livros vencedores do Radar, que é o nosso programa que tem encontrado talentos no Brasil através de editais muito generosos, que tem pago assim, de modo muito generoso os vencedores. E para nós é uma alegria, né? Ter esse canal no qual nós conversamos com grandes autores e grandes pensadores, exatamente dessa interface entre a fé, as ciências e a filosofia. Hoje nós temos o prazer, o privilégio de receber o professor John Walton. Já vou falar das credenciais acadêmicas, de modo resumido, senão isso tomaria mais de uma hora de conversa aqui, mas vou falar das credenciais acadêmicas do John Walton. Mas antes, pessoal, eu quero deixar aqui registrado que na conferência de inauguração da BC2, lá no ano de 2016, o John Walton foi um dos principais palestrantes do evento, né? A gente convidou ele como um dos keynote speakers, daqueles palestrantes mais importantes do evento, pela sua relevância para a reflexão entre fé e ciência, pela sua erudição nos estudos de Antigo Testamento e também por ser alguém comprometido com a fé cristã, algo que é parte fundamental da identidade da ABC2. Mas então vamos lá, né, para as credenciais. Vou começar com os nossos convidados. Em primeiro lugar, temos aqui o nosso querido Tiago Pereira. Boa noite, Tiagão, que é biólogo, mestre e doutor em botânica pela Universidade Federal de Viçosa e atualmente trabalha como coordenador dos grupos de estudo da ABC2. Ele é casado com a Elisa e pai de Pedro e Maria Clara. Temos aqui também o meu querido amigo, já de velhos carnavais, o Paulo Won, que é mestre em estudos bíblicos pela Universidade de Edimburgo, ou como ele falou agora há pouco, pela Universidade de Edinburgh. Ele é mestre em divindade pelo Seminário Teológico Servo de Cristo e também bacharel em Relações Internacionais pela PUC São Paulo. É pastor auxiliar na Igreja Presbiteriana Metropolitana, aqui em Campinas, da onde vos falo, e também serve como diretor da Escola Didascalia de Bíblia e Teologia, uma escola online. Você pode depois entrar no portal do Paulo e conhecer os recursos dele, pode acompanhá-lo também pelo Instagram, ele tem uma plataforma muito ativa, comunicando conteúdos, né? Então, Paulo, obrigado por aceitar o convite, para nós é uma honra tê-lo essa noite. Finalmente, nós temos o nosso convidado especial, o professor John Walton, que iniciou sua trajetória acadêmica como bacharel em economia. Olha só, também sou bacharel em economia, pelo Muhlenberg College, mas seu interesse pelo Antigo Testamento o levou a fazer mestrado em estudos bíblicos no Wheaton Graduate School, lá em 1975, e depois obteve um PhD em estudos hebraicos pelo Hebrew Union College. Dedicou 20 anos de ensino no Moody Bible Institute antes de ingressar no Wheaton College, onde continua seu trabalho de pesquisa e docência como professor emérito. é especialista em estudos comparativos entre a Bíblia e o Antigo Oriente Próximo. Alguns dos seus livros traduzidos em português são O Mundo Perdido de Adão e Eva, uma parceria da ABC2 com o Ultimato, O Mundo Perdido do Dilúvio, pela Thomas Nelson Brasil, Pensamento do Antigo Oriente Próximo e Antigo Testamento, pela Vida Nova, entre outros. Agora, gente, aquele momento que eu vou virar uma chavinha aqui para mudar a língua da qual eu estou falando, ok? Então, vamos lá. Now we can talk in English. So, Professor John Walton, I was just giving the introductions and saying what a pleasure it is to have you here this night. And it's a big honor for us from ABC Square to have you here. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure to be here.
That's great. So, as the host, I have the privilege of asking the first question. And I used to say that the first question used to be the most philosophical one. So here you go, Professor. Who are you? And by that, I mean, tell us a little bit about your trajectory, how you ended up studying the Hebrew Bible, and what's your particular interest in the book of Genesis, and maybe any other thing that you think is relevant about yourself.
Sure, I'd be happy to talk about my story. So I was raised in a Christian family. There were 5 of us kids growing up, and we were trained in the Bible early on. My parents and my church both had a big role in my biblical education from my youngest years. And so I grew up in the Bible, knowing the Bible, learning the Bible. Of course, that doesn't always mean you know what to do with the Bible, but I learned the information very well and early. So as a kid, of course, the things that you learn are all the trivia, the names and the places and all of that. And there's plenty of trivia in the Old Testament. And I learned it well, and so I was good at it. And that made me very interested in it. But I didn't see any kind of career path in that. Being a pastor or being a missionary didn't necessarily make use of the Old Testament. So when I went off to university, I really didn't know what to do. So I majored in economics. I was a economics and accounting major. And it wasn't until I was almost done university that it suddenly occurred to me that there are people who teach Old Testament. And the minute I recognized that, I decided that was what I wanted to do. So then I went on to graduate school in Old Testament, and I became very interested in the way that the ancient world could illuminate and inform us about the cultural background of the Old Testament. And so I started studying the ancient world, its history, its literature, its languages. And of course, in that area, became very interested in Genesis because there's so much of cultural background that's important to Genesis. I also married my wife, who was trained in biochemistry. And so we had the science and Bible thing going on right in our home. And that also gave me an interest in Genesis as I thought about those issues. So that's how I ended up having an emphasis in Hebrew, so I could read the text more closely, in the ancient world, so I could make the comparisons, and in the Bible and science conversation.
That's amazing. Thank you, Professor, for giving us a kind of small journey of your life and your interests in the Hebrew Bible. Now I ask, please, Paulo, can you ask your first question?
Yes, Dr. Olson, once more, it's good to be with you and with my fellows here. My question is this. In several works, you discuss the importance of understanding of the cultural river, right? Particularly in Genesis. How can this hermeneutic understanding of the ancient world be reconciled with what we know through science today? For example, about the scientific discoveries about the size of the universe or the age of the earth. In other words, how we reconcile hermeneutics and science. I think it's a broad question, but I want to hear from you.
Sure. Let me talk for about 24 hours on that.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah. No. So, I mean, that's really a key element as we come to this kind of conversation. Since in our modern times, we are learning the science, so much about science. We think about the world in scientific terms. It's very easy for us to want to bring those scientific questions to the biblical text and to consider issues of compatibility or interaction. That's a normal kind of thing for us to do. And that's why it's important for us to think about the cultural river as we think about hermeneutics. The fact is, we today are in a cultural river, and we have many different cultural rivers, of course, across the world. Mine is different from that which is in Brazil, but still, there are things in common, and the scientific viewpoint is part of that. So science is part of our cultural river. The Big Bang cosmology, evolutionary models, questions about the origins of the universe. Those are all questions that are very robust in our cultural river. But we can't assume that those were critical issues in an ancient cultural river. And part of the point I make is that the Bible actually unfolds and its communication takes place in an ancient cultural river. The biblical authors, even when we don't know who they were insiders, they were Israelites, and they were communicating to Israelites. And that means the cultural river of ancient Israel and the ancient world in general defined that conversation. That means that they're not necessarily going to be addressing things in our cultural river or questions that we have. And hermeneutically, if we try to force the text to address things that it's not addressing, we run a risk of misinterpreting or imposing something foreign on the text. My approach to the biblical text is that I don't want to impose that which is foreign on the text, which includes me. All of us as modern readers are foreign to the text. And so I want to try to penetrate that insider to insider communication. And that's done by taking a hard look, a deep look at the literature of the ancient world, because it's that literature that helps give us a profile of the cultural river of the ancient world. And of course, the Israelites were different from Egyptians and Babylonians in very important ways, but they're also the same in very important ways. So when we come to the Bible wanting to know things about science, we're going to be frustrated because it's not a science textbook. Lots of people say that, but it gets worse. Not only is it not a science textbook, it doesn't have any new science in it. Whatever science, what we call science, is there in the biblical text is the same science that Israelites shared with the Babylonians and the Egyptians. And therefore, we shouldn't expect to get scientific answers from a biblical text that's not addressing them. So that's a cultural river issue. It's part of the idea that we are outsiders coming into a conversation which is an insider to insider conversation. And just like earlier when all of you were speaking Portuguese and I had no idea what was going on, I was an outsider and was not able to penetrate that insider to insider conversation. And we have to recognize that the Bible has lots of those same features.
That's great. Marcelo had to leave us just for a minute, and I will pass the word to Thiago. Thiago, do your first question, please.
Okay. So, hello, Dr. Walton. It's a pleasure to be here. And it's a great pleasure to be here with you. And I hope to represent our listeners' questions well, too. So I want to follow Paulo in his question about the cultural river and add some more complexities to this. I want to. My question is whether this effort to grasp the cultural river in which the Bible was written. And I want to know whether this effort risks making us overly dependent on history or archaeology or other science. So would any interpretation without these tools be incomplete or even mistaken? You know what I'm talking about. I want to go further. What should we make of the readings that came before this approach? I'm thinking about those who claim that the interpretation of Genesis regarding origins remained unchanged for 18 centuries. And they often argue that newer perspectives should be viewed with suspicion or even rejected. And how would we respond to that concern? And okay, I stop here.
When we think about the history of interpretation, of course, it wasn't until 150 years ago that we began to have access to the ancient texts.
Okay.
So what about all those people before that? They didn't have that access. Does that mean they were all wrong? Does it mean that their quest for interpretation was hopeless? No, I don't think so. Much of the interpretation over the centuries since the beginning of the church was focused on questions about who is Jesus and what were they saying in their culture. They had no access to that, and so they didn't ask those questions. Every once in a while, you can see indications that would have interested them, but they had no way of getting that. Now, that doesn't make their interpretations wrong. It just means that there are some things that they couldn't do. And that remains the case today. There are some passages where we say, well, I don't know what's going on there. And maybe someday we'll figure that out because we don't have enough cultural information. But at the same time, we can ask literary questions, we can ask theological questions, and we can still learn much about the text and the message of Scripture. The basic message of Scripture, as I understand it, is that God is showing how he has worked out his plans and purposes over the ages, through history, through his people, over time. And you don't have to penetrate the culture to see the main flow of God's plans and purposes working out. And what he asks his people of all ages, whether it's the Israelites or the Jews of the Second Temple period or the Christians throughout history, what he asks is that we become full-fledged participants in his plans and purposes. You can get all of that without knowing the cultural background of the Old Testament. You don't have to be able to interpret all the complex passages to understand those basics. If you want to interpret the complex issues of a passage, though, you need those things. People who don't know Hebrew can still understand the Bible from their translations, but you get to a certain point where that becomes a hindrance, that you don't know Hebrew. And when people can learn Hebrew, they can get more insight into that. So these tools, the ancient world and Hebrew language, they just help us to get deeper and be able to understand more in those specific areas. But people without those things can still get the basic flow of what God's word is and what he asks of them.
That's great. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Thiago, for your great question. So, Professor Walton, based on that, I think there was a view that is now kind of debunked about the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, that used to say that the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament is divided in genres, right? And there was this wisdom genre. There was the 3 books of Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes. But I think that discussion moved on, and now it seems that for most scholars, the wisdom themes are kind of dispersed throughout the whole Hebrew Bible. So my question is, what's your particular take on this discussion? And particularly, how do you see wisdom themes in Genesis 1, 2, and 3?
Good, thank you. So let me start with the big picture. As I understand the ancient world, order was arguably the highest value that they had. They're always looking for order. They saw God or the gods as establishing order through the kings who are supposed to bring order, through people who desired order in their society and looked for order in the cosmos. Order was a high value. Having that idea in place, wisdom can be seen as the pathway to order. And so literature like Proverbs or Job or Ecclesiastes, we can see that those books deal with pursuit of order. Where do you find meaning in life? That's an order question that Ecclesiastes deals with. How do we find order in society and in families, in government? That's what Proverbs deals with. How do we find order when we suffer, when everything's going wrong? That's the book of Job. And so really behind the wisdom literature is this quest for order. And it's on that basis that we can see it rippling out through the rest of the canon. In Genesis, God established order. We call it creation. And God brought order to the cosmos. And then people are seeking order, and they take fruit from the tree of order, knowledge of good and evil, what's good for order, what's bad for order. And they take that fruit to become masters of their own order seeking for their own benefits. And through Genesis 2 through 12, they are seeking order in all kinds of ways that only work partially. And as those chapters unfold, the whole idea is people seek order, and the ways they seek it aren't always entirely successful. They're not ultimately adequate. And then we come to the covenant in Genesis 12, which is God's instrument for bringing order. That order is reflected in relationship, a covenant relationship, and ultimately in God dwelling among his people in the tabernacle and then the temple. So God's presence, and God's presence then is a resource for order in Israel. And so part of the covenant is the giving of the Torah, the law, which is telling Israel how they can order their society in order to bring honor to God's name. And so we can see that through all of these issues, through creation, through covenant, this is order being pursued and God stepping in to help establish order. And that continues even into the New Testament. You look at some of the early narratives in Mark, for instance, Mark 4 through 8 or so, where Jesus is stilling the storm. He's bringing order from the chaos of the storm. He's casting out the demons, restoring order. He's bringing healing and purity to the woman who's had the flow of blood, and then he raises from the dead. These are all order-bringing activities, and Jesus is seen as the Lord of order. And eventually, of course, Paul talks about him as the one in whom all things cohere, all things hold together. Through him, order is established. So this concept can give us a big idea of how things hang together.
Wow, that's really a tour de force. Thank you very much, Professor. Paulo, you can ask now your second question, please.
Going a bit deeper in the theme of God's presence, you assert that the theme or the plot of God's presence is more important than the plot of salvation, or what we could call history of salvation. To some, however, this may seem like a contradiction between two very significant concepts in biblical theology, in a way that the first overshadows the second. How do you view this relationship, and why this relationship is so important in your view?
Yeah, certainly, I don't want to devalue the importance of salvation. And I wouldn't use a term like overshadow, but rather it's a matter of scale. So when I think about the concept of God's presence, and for me, that goes hand in hand with relationship. God establishes relationship from the beginning when he creates people in his image to work alongside him. That's a relationship. Covenant is relationship. And when God establishes his presence among his people, that's in order to have a relationship. It's not just living there separately, but living there among them. So I see relationship and presence as the two main features of what the Bible's all about. Now, certainly salvation fits into that because it's salvation by which Christ in his death and atoning sacrifice makes relationship possible at a whole new level. So salvation becomes a subcategory of relationship because it represents one part of it. The relationship that God established with the covenant in the Old Testament didn't have salvation as part of it. He'd brought them out of Egypt, but not saving them from their sins. So in that sense, relationship is a bigger category than salvation, which is a subcategory. That doesn't make salvation unimportant. It just kind of puts it in the right place. And likewise, because of what Christ has done to bring us salvation, then we are cleansed and become receptacles for his presence through the Holy Spirit in us. And so the relationship leads to presence at a new level, and that's the presence of the Spirit. So in that sense, they all work together. The reason why I see relationship and presence as kind of the larger issues is because you can see those in the Old Testament. You can't see the salvation through Christ in the Old Testament. At least I don't believe so. Some people try to find it there. I don't see it there. But it's still a very important aspect that comes along in time and fits in the paradigm of relationship and presence. So I don't want to downplay salvation. I'm very grateful for my salvation and for everyone else's. But I want to put it in its place conceptually. And I hope that helps explain that a little.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Great. That's very impressive. Tiago, please, can you ask your second question?
Okay. So, Professor Walton, I recently came across the news that a new book in the Lost World series is set to be released soon this year, right?
Yes.
Yes, the title is New Explorations in the Lost World of Genesis, Advances in the Origins Debate. And from what I understand, you are revisiting the Lost World of Genesis 1 in your work. And I found this proposal fascinating, and I can't wait to grab this new book with me. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on 2 points here about this book. The first point is regarding the book itself, okay? So what led you to revisit this book? And what new insights do you think make this update necessary? Or has there been a shift in academic research or significant updates in recent years? Or are there new archaeological or textual discoveries that shed fresh light on that subject? And have your own views on any key ideas evolved over the last 15 years? Many questions, many short questions, but that's the first group of questions about the book itself and your ideas and the academic research. Okay, you can summarize. But the second point, and I like to reflect on intellectual virtue, and we talk a lot about intellectual virtues here in ABC Square, Marcelo especially. So I'd like to reflect on the intellectual virtues of revisiting a published work, especially one as foundational as the first volume in this series. It seems to me a great example of intellectual humility to acknowledge that a book is never truly finished, and that over time ideas can be refined and expanded and even corrected. So what does this process teaches us about the study of origins and the interpretation of Genesis? It's never truly finished.
Okay, so Lost World of Genesis 1 was published in 2009.
Okay.
And beginning probably about 2013, I started to get a lot of invitations to speak in places. And that's been a big part of my life in ministry for the last 12 years or so. that means that I've done presentations on that book hundreds of times in all kinds of contexts. And when you talk about a subject a lot, a couple things that happen. Number one, you learn better ways to communicate the ideas, learning that all the time, how to communicate better. Sometimes it's a new illustration or an analogy or a metaphor. Sometimes it's terminology that works better or phrases that work better. So I've learned a lot in giving all those presentations, and part of that is reflected in that book. Secondly, almost every time I present, there's Q&A, and people ask their questions, and I learn from those questions. And as I try to answer them more and more, I learn how to answer them, hopefully better and more clearly. And that's another part of this book, because it's got over 60 frequently asked questions and the answers that I offer to them. And so those are two of the aspects in this book. In the book, it's not a revised edition. It deals with both Genesis 1 and the Adam and Eve issues. So basically Genesis 1 through 3. And I go through about 8 topics, and the last one is science and faith. And so I deal with that specifically as well. In each one, I say, what did I say before? And that's just in a very brief summary. And then what's some of the new information that I've encountered, or new analogies, or new terminology, or new texts that I want to talk about, those kinds of things. And then I move to the frequently asked questions and offer what answers I have. So that's how the book works. There are some issues that I've changed my mind on, at least a little bit, and 1 or 2 places where I've changed my mind in a more significant way. A lot of that has to do with, again, sometimes questions that people ask that I get to thinking, well, I haven't been very clear, and I need to find a clearer way to express something. And that leads me to kind of reconfigure a little bit. But other places I've been challenged on something and decided, well, there's a better way to go. And so I've changed my mind. One of the largest influences there happens to be my son, who did his doctoral dissertation at St. Andrews. We've co-authored several books together. And he did his doctoral dissertation at St. Andrews on the order spectrum. I just talked about order, and on Genesis 2 through 4 and the order spectrum. And he really challenged me on several points. And some of them, that means that I've changed my mind about something. On others, it gives me a fuller approach that I reflect in this new book. I think it's really important, and this kind of moves into your second area of questioning. I think it's really important for us to remain willing to change our minds. I mean, we all like to be right. And I like to think that I'm right sometimes, at least. But the fact is, there are things I have changed my mind on over the years. And that means that I now think that what I said before was not right. So I talk more these days about being faithful in my interpretation, faithful to my convictions, faithful to the Word of God, faithful to a research that tries to understand things as well as I can with the information that I have. I even wrote a book on that called Wisdom for Faithful Reading, Principles and Practices for Old Testament Interpretation. So I try to be faithful with what I've got. That means if there's new information or new perspectives on something, faithfulness requires me to consider them very seriously, even if that means changing my mind on something that I've published previously. So that's sort of how I think about it. I want to have a perspective that's dynamic, not static. I don't want to get stuck and just say, well, since I published this 15 years ago, I can't consider any other options. I don't believe that's a good place to be. I think we have to remain open to consider new ideas as they're given to us.
No, it's
That's
amazing.
great. Can I add something?
Yeah, Please.
Can you share, Dr. Walton, with us if are there new archaeological or textual discoveries that you used to this new book?
No, they're not new archaeological things. They're new insights interpretively.
Okay, that's nice.
I do talk about texts in this volume that I didn't talk about before, but it's not because they weren't there. It's just I limited in the number of texts I can talk about.
Okay, okay.
No, that's great. You're sharing how your mind moves around these big ideas. That's very nice. So let me just ask you if you can share with us, after this big picture of how you thought about this new book, if you can share with us one example of one subject matter or thing that you changed your mind from the previous two books to this new one.
Sure. And this is one that my son persuaded me of. We had long discussions about these issues, and sometimes I'm very resistant, and he's very persuasive. So one of the key ones, I would have to say this is the most important one. When I first wrote The Lost World of Genesis 1 and The Lost World of Adam and Eve, I talked about God coming into the human realm and setting up a place for himself in the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden I saw as sort of a temple idea, a God coming to dwell in the human realm. My son has persuaded me that it really works better to think in terms of the Garden of Eden representing the divine realm. And God is putting humans in the divine realm instead of him coming into the human realm. One of the points that I argued as we kind of discussed this is that, well, but the rivers are the Tigris and Euphrates in the Garden of Eden. That sounds like it's in the human realm. And he patiently pointed out to me all the ancient Near Eastern texts in which the divine realm had the source of the rivers in it, including known rivers geographically. And that in the ancient world, they really believed that the divine realm was not so far removed from the human realm. You can think of the gods meeting on Mount Olympus if you wanted to go to Greek mythology, but in the ancient Near East, the flood hero, Utnapishtim, was moved to the divine realm at the source of the rivers. And that was someplace that Gilgamesh could get to. Great difficulties to do so, had to cross that river of death, very difficult. But it's still kind of the proximity is more than what we think of as the divine realm in heaven and we're on earth. So that idea of being in the divine realm, that made some sense in terms of the language, in terms of the ancient literature. And again, there's a full discussion of all of the reasoning that comes into that. But once I was persuaded of that, that changed some other things. In Genesis 2 and 3, Lost World of Adam and Eve, I talked about Adam's role as being that of a priest. Well, that worked if God's presence was in the human realm. But if humans are in the divine realm, you don't need a priest in that context. And so then that reopened to the question of what Adam and Eve's role was. And what I found when I did Lost World of Adam and Eve, I had to do a little two-step. That is that Adam and Eve were archetypes, so they represented all of humanity. But then I also had to say, and they were priests. And so their representation was of a different sort, as they represented people not as archetypes, but as priestly representatives. As archetypes, they are all of us. As priests, they would work for us. So I had that little two-part representation. If you make the move to people being in the divine realm, you don't need the priesthood side of it anymore. As a matter of fact, it doesn't really work. And what that does is it unifies the picture of humanity, of Adam and Eve, as archetypes all the way through. That's led me to take a much stronger position in saying that Adam and Eve are there in Genesis to be all of us. We shouldn't talk about them and us. They did this and we do that, or they're like this and we're like that. We should rather be thinking they are us. What they are, we are. What they do, we do. Their names are humanity and life. They are us. And therefore, that archetypal perspective overshadows, here I will use that term, overshadows the question of their individuality. Genesis is not using them as individuals, it's using them as archetypes. And it also starts to resolve some of the issues like that Augustine got all tied up with. If they sinned, why do we get stuck with the consequences? And in this view, you don't have that equation. We sinned. We all sinned. We always sin. This is what we do. All we like sheep have gone astray. Every one of us has turned to his own way. And so it's not their sin and we're stuck. It's we sin. And so in that sense, you can see how that one change, divine realm instead of human realm, had a ripple effect as other dominoes fell as I worked out the details. All of that's in the new book.
Wow. I'm sure that now I
We
will
need that.
buy it right away. That's just too much. That's amazing. Well, thank you, Professor. Paulo, now I think you can ask your last question, please.
Yes, Dr. Walton, a personal question, right? Is a kind of question of your perception of the difference or similarity between us and the Near Eastern civilizations. Do we have what we as 21st century Westerners have in common with the ancient Near Eastern civilizations like the Egyptians or Mesopotamians? And if there is a similarity, how this can eventually help us to understand better the ancient biblical text?
Well, people are people, and that's what we have in common. People in the ancient world experienced pleasure. They suffered from circumstances. They were greedy and selfish. They were generous and merciful. People are people. And we find that we today have those same impulses, those same reflections. It's because we share that common humanity. Mm-hmm. And in that way, we can understand how people in the ancient world ended up doing what they did in many cases. So people are people, and therein lie similarities. But culture is culture, and therein lie the differences. Because the shape of culture, the things that frame how different cultures think about the world, think about themselves, think about the past, think about God, those are all quite different. Mm-hmm. And so I think we can understand those texts when we understand people, but we recognize how those texts give us different perspectives as we come to understand culture. So, for example, on those differences, I've suggested, and I think it's patently true, they thought about creation very differently than we think about creation. The idea of being curious about how things come into existence is common ground. Mm-hmm. But I'm convinced that they even thought about existence differently than we do. To them, existence is tied to order, not tied to material. And that means that it's a very different perspective, and that makes creation a different kind of discussion. I think that they think about the past differently than we do. We can call it history. They're interested in history. We're interested in history. That's a commonality. But why do you think about the past? And what's important about the past? And how do you talk about the past? Those things are cultural, and they're very different. So I think we have to recognize those similarities and differences as we go along. If we had no similarities, we couldn't penetrate the literature at all.
Yeah.
But likewise, we shouldn't treat the ancient world as if they think the same way that we do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Tiago, please, you can ask your last question.
Okay. So I want to take a step back to the cultural river talk and talk about science and faith a little. But when considering the reading of God's two books, the Bible and nature, we often encounter passages in scripture that seem to contradict scientific claims. And this tension has led many to perceive faith and science as being in conflict, as if one must choose between them. And I think a key challenge is distinguishing when the Bible is describing a literal miracle, such as the miracles of Jesus or Elisha's floating axe in 2 Kings, and when a passage should be understood in light of the cultural river and literary conventions of the time. I recall, for instance, I have read your interpretation of the sun standing still in Joshua as a literary device. And how can we determine whether a passage should be read literally, symbolically, archetypically, hyperbolically, or metaphorically, etc.? Is such a distinction even possible? And if so, doesn't this complexity put lay believers in a difficult position when interpreting the Bible?
One of the books that my son and I wrote together is called Demons and Spirits in Biblical Theology.
Mm-hmm.
In that, we laid down a hermeneutical discussion where we used terminology reference and affirmation. Reference is when the Bible refers to how people thought in the ancient world. Cosmic geography with its solid sky, physiology, where they believed that cognitive processes took place in the heart and liver and kidney. Those are reference. The Bible's not teaching physiology. The Bible's not teaching cosmic geography. And so we called those reference. In those aspects of reference, God is accommodating culture, which communication always requires. So reference, but then there's affirmation. Affirmation are those things that the Bible is staking its claims. It's giving its truth message. This is what the Bible's authority stands behind. And so we have those affirmations. Everything in the Bible can be called reference because God's always entering into culture. Just to use language so it's all reference, but some of it also is affirmation. And aspects that are reference contribute to what the ultimate affirmations might be. So there's our hermeneutical task, to differentiate between reference and affirmation. With the aspects of reference, we're not trying to assess whether it's true or false. It's speaking into the ancient world based on how they thought in the ancient world. And again, there has to be some accommodation if effective communication is going to take place. Now, the hermeneutical task is to figure out what's affirmation. We don't want to turn what is simply reference into affirmation. For instance, that there must be a solid sky because the Bible says so. That's turning reference into affirmation. And so we have to be able to draw those distinctions, and that's the tricky job. Now, one of the ways that we do that, we used the rule of thumb, perhaps you could say, that if the thing you're talking about is something that everybody in the ancient world would have believed, then it's probably reference and not affirmation. So again, everybody in the ancient world believed there's a solid sky. God is accommodating that viewpoint, and that's reference, not affirmation. Okay, but you get to other things in the Old Testament, which, no, this is something that is new stuff. Maybe it's just a new perspective. That is, everybody in the ancient world believed you shouldn't murder. But why shouldn't you murder? Why is that part of Israel's Torah? That's where the affirmation comes in that differentiates from the general reference. And so we're looking for those things that are unique to Israel or to the biblical message to try to find the affirmations. Now, when we get to something like miracles, even the term miracle reflects a modern way of thinking rather than an ancient world of thinking. Because a miracle in our world says this is something that can only be explained supernaturally. It cannot be explained by natural cause and effect. For the word miracle to work, you need a system where you've got two categories, natural and supernatural. If you don't have two categories, the word miracle doesn't make any sense. And that's what we find in the ancient world. They didn't have two categories. They believed that God or the gods were doing everything. And therefore, there was no such category as natural, which, of course, in our modern scientific state, that's really important. Okay, science explores the natural world and can't really explore what we might call supernatural. But miracles as a term only works when you've got those two categories, and the ancient world did not. So when the Bible talks about God's work, there's no Hebrew word for miracles. It uses signs and wonders. Signs are indications that God is at work, so they can see God's work. But that could be something that we might explain by natural cause and effect. Wonders are those things which bring awe that they're happening. That talks about our response. They're wonders. They're beyond human ability and capacity. And so again, they don't speak of natural and supernatural, but they are reflections of God at work. So again, we're talking about a different world where people thought differently. And when we try to squeeze those into our categories, there are going to be some collateral damage along the way in our understanding. Now, did I get to all of your question? Do you want to follow up?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
That's amazing. Thank you. Thank you for your question, Thiago. Now I have a last question for Professor John Walton, which is different from all our previous questions, which is, Professor, what is your best memory from Brazil?
Oh my. Wow. I haven't thought about that. I don't know if I think it has to be the people that I met there.
Okay.
To me, that's such wherever I travel, I see all the places and the wonderful things, and that's great. But it's the people that I meet, and even because there's so many of them, I don't remember all the names. That experience of how excited everybody was there in Brazil to be founding this organization, ABC Squared, and to feel like they're kind of moving into new ground. And I was really impressed with the excitement and the organization and all of the people that I met that were involved in that process.
Yes, and I have to say to you that we always remember that conference, even those like me that wasn't physically there, but that moment was key for us, and your name is always remembered as an important person and a very, very relevant author for us, for our thinking, for all that I have done in Brazil. And so, yeah, that it's a great memory for you, and it is a great memory for us. And I just want to say that Professor Roberto Covolan, who was the first president of ABC2, is here listening to us. I think he's unable to open his cam, but he's very fond of you, and he was there, and he was elected as our first president that time. So yes, so again, in the name of ABC Square, ABC2, we thank you very much for your generosity, for your patience with our questions, for your just showing for us how to be thoughtful, caring, showing love of knowledge, but also love of people in the way you think, the way you write. So thank you very much, Professor, for your time with us this night.
You're very welcome. And I just want to tell you how encouraging it is to know that things that I'm trying to think through and write, that they can help other people think through these issues as well. So thank you for thinking along with me.
Thank you. Pessoal, eu quero agradecer a todos que estão aqui presentes, agradeço especialmente ao Paulo Won, nosso convidado de honra, ao Thiago Pereira aqui da casa, obrigado pela participação de vocês, pelas excelentes perguntas. E com isso, pessoal, ficamos por aqui. Um grande abraço a todos, continuem antenados aí nos nossos canais, no canal da Academia ABC2, da ABC2, para acompanharem as nossas iniciativas e atividades. Um abraço a todos e boa noite.